Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. We are streaming on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe, share, click the bell so that whenever we come up, you will be notified. So please like and share, and also go to the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. You can find us there. Santita Jackson and Friends. Become my friend there and share the show. Also at Santita J at X, formerly known as Twitter. Please, everybody, like and share the show. Like and share the show. As we are talking about the bomb strikes, uh, more than 300 of them launched by Iran on Israel. 99% of those strikes, thanks to the Iron Dome, were repelled. And some are saying that had Iraq wanted to, they could have really aimed at people, but they meant to send a warning shot. Indeed, this is in retaliation for the killings of 7 of their top military leaders on the same day that the World Central Kitchen killings took place. And so at the time, Iraq said this is a declaration of war and we will retaliate. And we've been hearing for the past few days that there was going to be a retaliation, there was going to be a retaliation. And so, okay, that's what we're hearing. And yet we're also hearing that this is unprecedented. And we're not hearing a lot about what led up to this. That is to say, the launching of the drone strikes that killed 7 of the top military personnel in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in the Damascus, Syria consulate. That is an act of hostility, an outright act of hostility. And we've got to talk about that today. What does that mean? We know that Israel has been looking for war with Iran, and they've wanted America to get in it. America's been reluctant to get into it, at least publicly. But now, with this ironclad, as President Biden said, pledge to defend Israel for any reason, what now? Are Americans willing to go to be a part of another war? Would this mean boots on the ground, or is everything mechanized now? Well, the fact is, war does kill people. And so let's talk about this. What does this mean as we are calling for ceasefire, as we're watching a peace movement really begin to flower in the United States once again? What will this mean? Will this draw America and Israel closer? As some people, I just saw someone from the Brookings Institution who said that America and Israel have not been, they've been at cross purposes since October 7th, as more and more of these deaths occurred. And yet we continue to send them money and arms. But the relationship, publicly at least, according to reports, has gotten more and more tense. So people are saying that perhaps this will bring Israel and America closer together. What do you think? What are you feeling? Please join my Morning Stars on the Santita Jackson and Friends page on Facebook. And also meet us right over here on AM 950 Radio, AM 950 Radio. They also stream on am950radio.com. I have got Phyllis Bennis. Oh my goodness, Phyllis Bennis. I don't even know what to say. I don't know where to begin. I've got Dr. Stevens Eunice, who's overseas. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to begin. Indeed, you all are 2 of the leading experts in this space, in the peace space, in global affairs, as we look at the Middle East. When I want to find out what is going on, I turn to the both of you. And today I am completely bewildered, Professor Eunice from the University of San Francisco. I just don't know what to say. And Institute for Policy Studies, Phyllis Bennis, I don't know what to say. Let me start with you, Phyllis Bennis. What do you say? What are we looking at here? Are we looking at the beginning of World War III? Are we watching a rapprochement between Israel and the United States? And how is this going to land with Americans? I was watching Washington Journal early today, and Americans don't seem to be in the mood for another war, and they do not seem to be in the mood to continue to fund a country that is continuing to kill Palestinians. There's a lot going on here. But then you don't want to see Israel under attack. But they're calling this unprecedented. Why don't we start there, Phyllis Bennis? They're saying this is unprecedented. Mm.
Well, that's a big word, Santita. Thanks. This is one of those things where context is everything.
Mm.
And the key thing, and I've said this so many times on your show, I can't even remember how many, history and our understanding of history starts with when we start the clock. So the notion that this is something that just happened, that Iran just started shooting at Israel, is not the case. The notion that the escalation of massive violence and genocide, real, official, legally defined genocide across the Gaza Strip began somehow on October 7th is not the day we start the clock. Context is everything. And one of the things we've been seeing since the assault began after October 7th and these months of genocide took shape in Gaza, we've been seeing a huge escalation of violence across the region. The US has been saying, we don't want escalation. We don't want escalation. But the US moves have been in completely escalatory ways. Everything that has happened in response to the Israeli genocide, whether it's, and some of these things are not, in my view, abiding by international laws, restrictions, but they do have a political context, such as the attempts to stop ships in the Red Sea by Houthi militia folks. Now, some of what they're doing is illegal. That's true. It's also true that it's rooted in trying to stop the attacks on Gaza by stopping some of the ships that enable global trade in that context. So it is technically illegal and it has a basis. The response of the US has not been to either negotiate the idea of diplomacy rather than war as our go-to position on all of these issues, I think, also means that what we're seeing has been an escalation on the side of the US. They've began shooting directly at Houthi boats and attacking Houthi centers inside Yemen, the poorest country in the Arab world until the Gaza crisis. So in that context, what are we seeing now? We're seeing a situation in which the US, from the moment of the escalation that began in October, and it's an escalation, it's not the beginning of something new, but it's a serious escalation, and it's one in which the Palestinians continue to pay the highest price in lives and in the destruction of their land and in the destruction of their rights. In that context, we have President Biden saying stop and don't to almost everybody in the region, to the Houthis, to Hezbollah, especially, of course, to Hamas. But to Israel, they refuse to say no. Instead, they say, we have your back. And once in a while, they say, we would appreciate it if you would maybe not kill quite so many Palestinian civilians all at once. Can you tone it down just a bit? That was as much as of the request as we got. There was no stop and don't, because if you don't stop, there's no more weapons. If you don't stop, there's no more $4 billion a year directly to your military, amounting to 20% of your entire military budget. If you don't stop, we will no longer protect you from being held accountable at the United Nations and in the International Court of Justice and in the International Criminal Court. We're not doing that anymore. But we never heard those words, and we still haven't. That's the challenge. And all of this is rooted in the outrage across the region and around the world at Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, which is continuing right now. And one of the worst things that we're looking at right now, and I'll end on this, is that in this context, the caution that we were hearing, the New York Times yesterday in their lead editorial saying, no more aid to Israel that is unconditional. It must be conditioned on human rights laws here in the United States. All of that is now at risk because the Israeli response was to say that the Iranian attack last night somehow just happened. They had no right to do it. It was based on nothing. And somehow, all of a sudden, they're popular again in the US. And Benjamin Netanyahu, who was massively unpopular in Israel, has reclaimed much of his popularity, and he's reclaimed far too much of it here in Washington. So the danger is that all of the pressure that was just barely beginning to be felt, just barely beginning, is now going to stop. That's why we have so much work to do now in response to this latest move.
What about this characterization of this as being unprecedented? What do they mean? I'm missing something.
The specifics of that have to do with the ongoing, what's been known as the shadow war between the US and Iran for the last decade or more. And in that context, there have been various kinds of attacks, some cyber, some direct military. Israel has chosen assassination as its weapon of choice against Iran, assassinating particularly Iranian scientists with the goal of eliminating Iran's access to knowledge, particularly nuclear science, as if you can put that somehow back in the bottle with the genie and shove in the stopper and that'll be that. But there has never been direct attacks from the territory of Iran onto the territory of Israel, and vice versa, from the territory of Israel with missiles against Iran. There have been direct attacks on Iranian territory by Israel, particularly these assassinations, also a number of other attacks that have been widely attributed to Israel without Israeli confirmation. But this was an explicitly claimed attack. The fact that Iran notified the Americans as well as others around the world about what they were going to do, made sure that the defenses were in place so that there were virtually no casualties, virtually no damage, even to military targets, which were the targets of these Iranian drones. It's still a situation where the fact of an attack from Iranian territory towards Israel, we can only assume that most of them were targeting Israel. We don't even know that for sure, but they were, because many of these drones and missiles were taken out before they ever got close to Israel. But the assumption is that they were targeting military targets in Israel, and that was new. That was a different level. But the notion that this was somehow a new level of hostility is simply not the case. This shadow war between Iran and Israel has been going on for a very long time. We saw some of it here in the United States back in 2015, at the time that the Iran nuclear deal was being negotiated by the Obama administration, when Joe Biden was the vice president, was a big supporter at the time. And the Israelis were dead set against having a deal that would, among other things, significantly halt Iran's nuclear programs, its non-weapon nuclear programs, nuclear power, etc. In that context, the Republicans in Congress invited Bibi Netanyahu, who was then, as now, the Prime Minister of Israel, to come and address a joint session of Congress as if he were the president. And he came and he mobilized opposition within the Congress, trying to convince them to vote against their own president and instead to favor the position of this country 6,000 miles away, Israel. It was an outrageous thing to do. And it was in that context that we saw how this shadow war between Iran and Israel was playing out and was even having consequences with our own democracy here. You had 60 members of Congress, mainly from the Black Caucus, who refused to attend, who boycotted Netanyahu's speech, mainly because of how racist he was towards President Obama. When Biden was elected, during his campaign, and again, as soon as he was elected, he said he would immediately return to the Iran nuclear deal, which Trump had walked away from. But he never did that in a serious way. He made some motions about it in the first few months and then gave up and said, we're done. We're not going to go back to the Iran nuclear deal. And since that time, the tension, the hostility across the region has involved not only Israel, but the United States as well, for refusing to return to the nuclear deal. So all of this is rooted in this privileging of the privileging of Israel's militarism without any accountability, despite the fact that it's being carried out with our money and with our weapons.
We've been talking with Phyllis Bennis, National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace, Institute for Policy Studies. I urge you to get her book. Her book. It's a primer on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You have got to get it. You have got to get it. Indeed, Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict is the title. It will really help you to understand what we're looking at because, as you said, Phyllis Bennis, we've got to frame this. But let me pivot to you. Dr. Stevens Eunice. You are overseas, and I thank you for making the time for us once again to be with us as I'm rattling the cage with you. But after the night that we had last night, I said, I've got to talk with you. And I think you also, because you're not in the country, you can give us yet another perspective of how this is landing, if you will, no pun intended, in Europe. But of course, he is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco, one of the great thought leaders of our time. And I'm so glad that you're with us again. What happened? And give us the frame for this, because I think that the sand just shifts every day.
Yeah. I think, I mean, you talked about the unprecedented part, and I really appreciate Phyllis putting this in the broader context, including the fact, that there have been 70,000 tons of explosives dropped on the crowded urban areas of the Gaza Strip in the past 6 months, and none of them were intercepted. Okay, so
say that one more time for everybody.
Yeah, that 70,000 tons of explosives have been dropped on Gaza, and we're talking about at least 24,000 civilian deaths, the majority of the homes destroyed, over 2 million people displaced, at least 12,000 of these people are children who have died in these attacks. I mean, that again, not a single one of these was intercepted, and like the Iranian cruise missiles and drones were. And so that's the context I want to start in. In terms of significance, I mean, as Phyllis did point out, it's the first time that Iran has attacked Israel directly. Indeed, it's the first time any foreign state has attacked Israel since Saddam Hussein lobbed some Scud missiles into Israel during the Gulf War in 1991. Another unprecedented thing is this is the first time that the United States has been directly involved in a shooting war in support of Israel. That it was U.S. forces that shot down some of the cruise missiles, and so this is something that is new. But in terms of what happened, I mean, in addition to this long shadow war, a proxy war, whatever you want to call it, that's been going on between Israel and Iran, we did have the attack a little less than 2 weeks ago, where Israel bombed a diplomatic facility in Damascus, killed some leading Iranian generals. I mean, these guys are pretty nasty, to be honest. I mean, they were part of a special force that has supported some of these militia in Syria and Iraq, that have committed atrocities and the like. But these were diplomatic facilities, and as diplomatic facilities, legally speaking, they are diplomatic facilities are legally the sovereign territory of the country they represent. And so Israel's attack on this diplomatic facility, on this embassy annex, was therefore an attack on Iran. So Israel attacked first. And it's interesting how the United States, got so obsessed with Iranians violating our embassy back in 1979, 80, with the whole Iran hostage crisis, seemed to not have a problem with Israel actually killing people in the facility. And Iran's response was actually fairly restrained. I mean, Iran has some far more powerful missiles, and a lot of them, that could not have been intercepted, and done an enormous amount of damage, killed a lot of Israelis. But they chose to show some restraint. This was somewhat performative in many respects. And they probably felt they had to. I mean, the Iranian public, though they're increasingly alienated with the regime domestically, the Iranians are pretty nationalistic, and they've been largely supportive of that. The government finally, struck back after months and years of Israeli provocations, and one unfortunate number of unfortunate aspects of all this is probably, at least for the time, strengthened the regime somewhat. But in many ways, Israel is the victor here, because when the primary conflict is seen as Israel versus Palestine, most people, even in the United States, increasingly, are more sympathetic with the Palestinians. But if it's seen as Israel versus Iran, they're given the nature of the Iranian regime and all, tends to be more sympathy towards Israel. So it's in Israel's interest to provoke confrontation with Iran. For the sake of Palestinians, it's important for Iran not to take the bait. But it's something that's very much in Israel's interest to essentially distract people from the horror going on in Gaza, to force the United States to be more closely aligned with Netanyahu. I think it's important to point out that is Iran and their allies, the Hezbollah, they have no interest in taking on Israel at this point, where they would face devastating destruction. Israel's so much more powerful, but especially since they are currently winning simply by holding back and watching the Islamic world become increasingly radicalized by witnessing Israel's ongoing slaughter of Muslims in Gaza, with the support of the United States and other Western states, along with the inability of Arab governments to stop them. So they're cool about they don't want to take on Israel. They can get all the political benefits without that, and so and that's why they take Hezbollah, for example, the Iranian ally in Lebanon. Israel's been bombing their positions quite a bit, as well as in Syria. But they've lobbed a few rockets into northern Israel, to as a show of solidarity with the Palestinians, to show they're not just going to sit back and get bombed. But again, they have a pretty sizable arsenal as well that could hit anywhere in Israel that they could unleash if they wanted to. They really are trying to lessen tensions. And Biden, while he's certainly been shown his willingness to allow Israel to do whatever the hell it wants in Gaza, despite some finger wagging, it is apparently applying some pressure on Israel not to expand things, because if it does end up to being a bigger war, the United States will be involved to some degree. Iran and its allies, in addition to fighting Israel, we'll see the United States as Israel's primary arms supplier and supporter as a target. American forces could get shot at, American shipping and economic interests. If the fighting extended to the Gulf, there's about 25% of the oil supplies, world's oil supplies, right there being cut off. And you can imagine the impact on prices and the global economy and that kind of thing. The Biden administration, for practical reasons, not moral or legal reasons, which they tend not to care that much about, but on a very practical level, are recognizing that this can't get out of hand, and has been really trying to get Israel and the war cabinet to not to escalate, especially since Iran's been very clear. Okay, we're done. We've made our point. And that they're not threatening further action unless Israel attacks them again.
So why did they do it when they were winning these political points? Is it because of nationalism? Were the people of Iran Iran saying, "Look, you've got to do something"?
Yeah, and there was some pressure, and again, this was. I think there's concern that Israel's been escalating these kinds of things more and more, and I think at some point that Iran had to say, "Okay, that's enough. You've crossed the line now." When you attack, what is again, legally speaking, Iranian soil, and so it was a sign that there were limits to what they would be willing to put up without some kind of without some kind of response. So this is a calculated response, and probably a fairly rational one by some measures. But again, you're playing with fire here, because there are some, the tensions are high. There's a lot of weapons, and there are a lot of leaders there, both in Israel and Iran, who have political points to score, both for their own standing internally and internationally. And it is definitely a pretty scary situation.
What do you think their next move will be, Dr. Zunas?
I think they're going to try to hold back and try to and hope Israel doesn't escalate. But I'm sure they've got contingency plans if they do.
We're joined by Dr. David Gibbs from the University of Arizona. I guess I just had to get everybody up to date, because we keep hearing, Dr. Zunas and Phyllis Bennis, that, hey, this could be the beginning of the Third World War if we're not careful. And sometimes I think hubris makes us believe we can do anything. I mean, what did Einstein say? Well, he didn't know what was going to happen with the Third World War, but he said, I do know that the next one will be fought with sticks and stones. Nobody would survive it. Dr. Gibbs, what happened? And will America get involved? More involved, shall I say?
I think that one possibility here, and I say this is just a possibility because I can't read people's minds, but one possibility is that Israel wants to do what some have long advocated Israel do, which is to drag the United States into a full-scale war with Iran. Not a ground war, but an air war. There has long been advocates in Israel and outside of Israel that Israel should, Israel has over the last 20 years, Israel has developed its air force with specialized strike aircraft with longer range capability and in-flight refueling and bunker-busting bombs that are capable of attacking underground Iranian nuclear test facilities. Iran doesn't actually have nuclear weapons, but they're considered something of a threshold nuclear power that could develop them on relatively short notice. And this has been alarming to the Israelis, and it's alarming to everybody, including me, although the Israelis, of course, themselves have nuclear weapons. So there's that. But nevertheless, Israel has long seen Iran as a uniquely threatening state. It's not a vassal of the United States, as many of the other states in the area are. And, the idea basically of undertaking a series of strikes against Iran's nuclear weapons facilities by Israeli aircraft, and then inviting Iranian retaliation against Israel, and then bringing the United States in. This has been discussed in policy circles in Israel and by their supporters in this country as an option. Now, how much? The big question is, are the Israelis trying to do that? Are the Israelis trying to create an escalatory ladder where that will in fact happen? I don't know the answer to that, but I would say that there's at least one possibility here that has to be considered. And obviously, it's an extremely dangerous possibility. Even if that doesn't happen, I think one of the consequences of what's going on now in the Middle East is it greatly increases the likelihood that Iran will, in fact, at some point in the near future, develop nuclear weapons. I think it increases that risk. And basically, because that risk has been increased, that increases Israel's likely inclination to want to take out some of those facilities. Again, the possibility of a greatly widened Middle Eastern war involving not only Syria, but of course Hezbollah and Lebanon. Not Syria, Iran, as well as Hezbollah and Lebanon. That's always been a possibility, and what's been happening now in the last few days, increases that possibility. I think one of the things one has to go back to in terms of the chronology of events is not only was October 7th a horrific attack, and it was a horrific attack, but it was a humiliation for the Israeli military forces, the vaunted military forces of Israel, which were humiliated by the attack. To this date, we don't really have a good explanation of how it was even possible, but something clearly happened, and it humiliated the IDF. It also humiliated Netanyahu, who was supposed to be Mr. Security. And I think basically trying to demonstrate Israel's military prowess through force in order to make up for their failures on October 7th is part of what has been going on here. And the question is, how far does Israel want to go with that? And we don't really have a good answer yet. So I think there's a really big danger here of a greatly escalated war that would put the United States front and center in terms of being a participant. That's what I'm worried about.
Phyllis Menace, if this puts the United States front and center, and it's like you get that little scratchy feeling in the middle of your palm, and that means that something good is supposed to happen to you. But it seems like Israel, doesn't seem like they have stated they want America to be at the center of a war with Iran. What would that look like for the United States? Even if it's an air war, not a ground one.
Yeah, I appreciate what David Gibbs was just saying. I'm not sure that Israel, certainly not the majority of people, but also even the majority of the war cabinet and the Israeli military, I'm not sure they want to go head to head in a full-scale air war or other kind of war with Iran. I think some of this comes down to the more narrow political interests of the prime minister, of Netanyahu, who desperately needs this war in Gaza to continue, because as soon as the hostages are out and the attention of the population moves beyond that, he is likely to lose his position. He will no longer be the prime minister. And as soon as he is no longer prime minister, it's not just a matter of being embarrassed or not being able to continue in his position of power. He very likely goes to prison. So this is a very personal demand for Netanyahu, is to stay the war, stay the course, if you will. First, in some ways, there needs to be escalation to do that. But I don't know that I agree that it means that they are actually trying to escalate to the tune of a straight up full-scale war that would involve the U.S. directly. I don't think that's impossible, but I don't think that's the first choice. I think the first choice is to make good on the new support that Netanyahu is getting, the fact that he now is, even if people are furious with him, holding him responsible for the lack of response to October 7th, the fact that the intelligence wasn't there when it should have been, all those things, and that they don't like the way he's waged the war. They don't believe that he really cares about the hostages. All of those things are going to come back as soon as there are elections, and that could happen at any time. The problem that we face here in the United States, among other things, is that there's a rising anti-Netanyahu emerging, I'm not even sure what to call it, but sort of an emerging campaign against Netanyahu, discrediting among the most ardent supporters of Israel, including people like Nancy Pelosi, including people like Chuck Schumer, more than anybody else, more overtly, going after Bibi, saying that he is wrong, that he's being extreme, and he's being held up by his extremist, what I would consider the fascist wing of his war cabinet. What that means, the danger of that, is not that it's wrong. I mean, everything that everybody is accusing Netanyahu of, in my view, is right and then some. The problem is it implies that if someone else were to become the prime minister, the most likely is a guy named Benny Gantz, a former general. If Benny Gantz becomes the prime minister instead of Netanyahu, what happens in Washington? Washington opens their hearts and their wallets and their arsenals to the new guy who's not Bibi Netanyahu. That's all you have to say about him. He's not Netanyahu. So my God, he's got to be the best thing since sliced bread, right? And Benny Gantz is very far from the best thing since sliced bread. This is a man who ran for prime minister much earlier in 2016, and his campaign video was based on a video he shot from a helicopter over Gaza in 2014, after what was then the most extreme Israeli assault on Gaza that had happened. Nothing towards the level that we're seeing this year. But at that time, it was the worst military assault on Gaza ever. And it led to what Benny Gantz himself said in this video. You can see we bombed Gaza back to the Stone Age. And that was why he was telling people, you should vote for me, because look what I did. I bombed Gaza back to the Stone Age. Isn't that great? You should vote for me. He was proud of it. He was proud of the role that he played. And in that context, this attack on Netanyahu, I think, is actually quite dangerous because it assumes that this is a one-man show, that if only Netanyahu was out of the way, everybody else would be rational. They wouldn't try to be imposing a genocide. They would allow in humanitarian aid. They would stop the bombing of civilians, none of which is true. The disagreements that people have with Netanyahu are massive, and they are legion, but they are not about how the war in Gaza should be waged. They're about things like Israeli democracy, whether or not the judiciary should remain independent, whether or not somebody in Netanyahu's position should be held accountable for the failures of his intelligence agencies, for the failure of his military to protect people when they were attacked on October 7th. Those are real issues, but they don't disagree. If you look at all these massive protests that are going on, hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets calling for Netanyahu to be kicked out of office, down with Netanyahu. But they're not talking about stop the war in Gaza. They're not talking about ending Israeli apartheid, ending occupation, none of that. And that's why they have hundreds of thousands of people at the protests and not 500 people. You know, the 500 people or the 5,000 people maybe. But instead they're having 400,000 people in the streets because they're not calling for Palestinian rights and an end to genocide. So that's the contradiction that we're looking at for the United States. For the United States, the relationship with Israel goes back, it goes back almost a century, but it specifically goes back since 1967 when the so-called special relationship emerged. And that's not dependent on the relationship with Netanyahu. But as these things get personalized, all we have to do is get Netanyahu out of the way, and then it'll all be okay. Because then we don't have to talk about what somebody is doing in Gaza, because people are dying in Gaza, because children are starving in Gaza. Because it's not Netanyahu who's responsible, it's our guy. So we don't have to talk about it as much. That's the danger. That's why when I say that Palestinians are now and will continue to pay the highest price for this current escalation, that's what I'm talking about.
Dr. Junas, I think that the ground has shifted in the United States. Because even beyond Netanyahu, I mean, Americans now see Israel differently, I think.
Yeah, I really think there has been a shift, and it's a huge generational shift in many respects, and including within the Jewish community, which is, I think, quite significant. And of course, again, that is why Netanyahu and others want the focus to be on Iran. I mean, how often in the past day or so have people been talking about this food reaching starving Palestinians, or the ongoing bombing of civilian targets, or for that matter, the protests in Israel to get Netanyahu to be more flexible to get the hostages home. It's all about Iran, and what's going to happen next. And that's exactly what Netanyahu wants, and indeed, I think that's what a lot of supporters of Israel want. And I want to underscore what Phyllis said, that Netanyahu is an easy scapegoat, because he is so crooked, because he's so extreme, because he's so ideological. But there is no conceivable Israeli coalition government that realistically I can see coming to power that would really do anything much different in Gaza, and certainly none that would be willing to accept a viable, independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. I mean, this is that, and I think this focus on Netanyahu, and I think in many ways is a quite deliberate way of avoiding looking at this sad reality. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the Israeli Knesset, 99 out of the 120 members of the Israeli Knesset voted to reject, Palestinian statehood. And the Biden administration, despite its lip service to Palestinian statehood, is ready to veto Palestine's membership in the United Nations. They've started a new initiative in the Security Council to have that done. Now, remember, this is the same United States that praised the United Nations for passing the Resolution 181 back in 1947 that created the State of Israel. But the U.S. position is, yes, UN can create a State of Israel without consulting the Palestinians, but you cannot create a Palestine unless you get the okay of the Israelis, who categorically ruled out even having a Palestinian state. And in fact, they've underscored this in the that by U.S. law, any UN agency that accepts the state of Palestine as a full member, the U.S. will cut off all funding for this. And in fact, in the appropriations bill, the U.S. has cut all funding for the Palestine Authority if they become a full member state of any UN agency. And then just a few days ago, the United States was one of only 2 countries in the 43-member UN Human Rights Council to vote against a resolution that called for the for a 2-state solution of Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. So, you know, the one of the biggest myths we have is that the United States supports a 2-state solution, because, you know, the United States is doing everything possible to prevent that, you know, by blocking the UN from taking action, by ruling out conditioning, military aid to pressure Israel, and even actively working against civil society efforts like boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, you know, to pressure Israel. So this I think it's really important whenever we're talking about this to challenge the myth that there are moderate forces in Israel that want a genuine 2-state solution, or that, I mean, there are some, but they're pretty marginalized. They're not realistically in a position to take power anytime soon. And even though the vast majority of Americans support a 2-state solution and pressuring Israel to do what's necessary to make that possible, the Biden administration and the leaders of both parties in Congress are not willing to make that happen either.
But do Americans, Dr. Zunas, before I go to you, Dr. Gibbs, and you, Phyllis, I mean, it seems to me that the power structure don't really understand what's happening, not just on the ground, but in the broader world. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're watching Saudi Arabia join BRICS. I mean, it's no longer a unipolar world. I mean, this new world order, the economic and social and political order is being reordered, and America is increasingly out of step and out of the mix. And we are being isolated. I mean, Dr. Zunas, or am I misreading this?
This has been, I mean, and this is why a lot of the, you know, neo-realists, political scientists and others, John Mearsheimer and Steve Waldman, so these guys, you know, I
but absolutely pilloried.
Yeah. But I mean, frankly, I disagree with them in terms of their analysis that I think they exaggerate the power of the Israel lobby. But where they are correct is recognizing that U.S. support for Israel is really hurting our standing in the world. That even putting aside the moral questions, the legal questions, which as realist international relations type, they don't really care about that much anyway. but again, purely from narrow U.S. self-interest, this is a disaster, and it is really hurting our standing in the world, and that it is weakening the United States. I mean, how can we, with a straight face, talk about Russian atrocities in Ukraine? You know, when they send missiles into apartment blocks, and we're so horrified by that, as we should be. But when we support Israel doing this many times more, or talk about the illegality of expanding territory by force in Ukraine, while we support Israel doing it, or are concerned about nuclear non-proliferation, with Iran or whatever, when we support even deny Israel's nuclear arsenal. I mean, just go down the list. Support for Israel has greatly compromised America's standing, and it makes Biden's rhetoric about this rules-based international order seemed like a total joke, which of course feeds right into the hands of Putin and Assad and the Iranian mullahs and all sorts of other nasties, who can then just point out U.S. hypocrisy. And again, it is totally, even putting aside the moral legal issues, it's a total disaster, disastrous policy.
Dr. Gibbs, I mean, what do you say? Because even Trump has said, I heard him on the Hugh Hewitt show. Look, I am agnostic about where I just want to hear what people have to say. I mean, even right, left, center, I don't care. I want to hear what people are talking about. And I want to hear the context in which they're saying it. When Trump said Israel needs to finish the job, what he actually said was, you don't know this is a PR disaster. You need to get back to normalcy and peace. I didn't say that. He said that. Before you all call in and say she's a Trump apologist. No. And I don't need to say that. My politics are well known, period. That having been said, he said, look, you all are collapsing buildings and people assume that people are in there. This is awful. You need to end this quickly. That's what he said. And it's like, that puts him to the left of Biden, Kennedy. I mean, it's just, this is really bizarre. Now you've got this. And you still have people, and you still have all of these people dying. And I just read an article in which people are coming to Dr. Zunas and Phyllis Bennis and Dr. Gibbs. These people are planning to come to rock the House in August at the Democratic Convention. There will be more activity outside than indoors. I mean, people are planning, don't even want to talk about their plans. They said, oh, no, we're just going to show up in Chicago. I said, oh, boy, what does that mean? Everything. Dr. Gibbs. Everybody, I've got about 6 minutes here, so I'm going to give everybody 2 minutes to close. Of course, I'm going to end with you, Phyllis. Dr. Gibbs.
Trump is, as always, very hard to read in that he, he's completely fickle in terms of his policies. He changes on a dime very often, and he could. My sense of the most likely scenario, I think, is he's more likely to perhaps wind down the conflict, just because, being the narcissistic figure he is, by the time he comes into office, it'll be such an albatross around the neck of the United States he would be about to lead if he were elected. It's very possible he would wind down the conflict, although he might just as easily expand it, given the fact that he's completely unpredictable. So I don't really want to make any predictions about what Trump would or wouldn't do. Biden is much more, I think he sees himself as the next Harry Truman. And, he wanted to be a great foreign policy president. I don't think he's really that interested in domestic policy, honestly. He's been on the Foreign Relations Committee, and I suspect most of what he thinks about most of the time had been expanding American power. What he wanted to do initially was to knock Russia out of the League of the Great Powers and sort of do a shot across the bow to China and sort of reaffirm American primacy for decades to come and become a great foreign policy president. That's how he saw it. That's how he saw himself. That backfired disastrously, as we've seen. Russia has not been defeated. It's more powerful than it was before. There's Cavoli, the former commander of NATO, has testified to that effect, that it's more powerful than it was 2 years ago. Russia is set to win this war in Ukraine, and there's probably nothing the United States can do to stop it. It's really quite brazen, the extent to which, not just, again, I'll leave aside the issue of Russia because I'm not a citizen of Russia. Obviously, we condemn the invasion, but, there was a near settlement of this conflict in Istanbul a month into the war, and we now know the United States and Britain blocked it. And that was a very cynical, brazen thing to do, and it underscores a certain recklessness by Biden that's extraordinary and goes, I come out of this I studied the Afghan war in the 1980s, and there were a lot of very dangerous things the Reagan administration was doing. It doesn't come close to what's going on in Ukraine right now. And the damage it's doing to America's longstanding, role in the world. The CIA had issued a directive that the risk of nuclear war early in the war was 20 to 25%. it's extraordinary Biden was willing to take the kind of extremely reckless risks with all of our lives, but that's exactly what he did and what he's still doing. And then along comes this war in the Middle East out of nowhere, which further damages America's standing in the world. The U.S. is not going to come out of this unscathed, either of these two wars. It's going to do long-term damage to America's standing, to America's alliances, and it's probably irretrievable at this point. And I don't see a happy ending here for really anybody involved. And as I noted, I'm very worried about the possibility, and it is just a possibility, but it remains. This war could expand dramatically if there's a significant, really large-scale air war between the U.S., Iran, and the United States. I would not rule that out as a possibility. And again, I emphasize a certain reckless tendency by both Israel and the United States that we've been seeing over the last few years that surprises me how far it's gone. I mean, Israel's attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, that was a brazen violation of international law. And it was obviously going to escalate the situation. It was intended to escalate the situation. The question is, how far does Israel want to go with this? And how far will the United States back them up?
Well, Dr. Zunas, in about 90 seconds, you can cross the Rubicon, but hubris makes you believe that you can't. But you can go too far.
Yes, and again, and that's the difference with Trump. I mean, he sometimes sounds like he's more moderate, sounds like he's less interventionist, but he really is, because of his impulsivity and whatever. I would, I've been spending much of the past 3.5 years attacking Biden's foreign policy, but I really think Trump would be worse. But having said that, I think we are at a very dangerous time. But I do think that given we are in such a more interdependent world, and that the ramifications of a wider war are not just so scary for humanitarian reasons, but also, for the dangerous for many of the powerful, wealthy elements in the United States and around the world, that things will not get out of hand. But again, I can't say that with confidence, and it's certainly a very frightening time.
Phyllis Bennis, 90 seconds for you.
I think that we are in a very dangerous moment, and it isn't only about elections. It's about right now. And I want to bring it back to the war in Gaza, where people are still being killed under Israeli bombs last night, again today. Children are still starving to death on our watch. So the movement that has grown up, the uncommitted or uninstructed movement around this country, there's now more than 500,000 voters have voted in the Democratic Party primaries to say, we don't want to accept the reality of this current president with his current policies. And too many people, I think, are asking the wrong question. They're asking, how do we make sure that those people can be persuaded to vote for Biden anyway? That's the wrong question. Number one, this is not just about elections. This is about saving lives. And number two, it's the wrong question because it's not going to work. It's really not going to work. The right question is, how do we build a movement that is already underway to persuade, to convince, to cajole Joe Biden into ending the U.S. support for genocide? That's the key right now. That's what's so urgent right now. In Michigan, it was over 100,000 voters. Wisconsin and Minnesota were each hovering around 50,000 votes. There's going to be those states, and Washington State and Hawaii. There were all enough protest votes to send these uncommitted delegates to the National Convention. And what happens outside of that is going to be as important or more so than what happens inside. We know who the candidate is going to be. That's not really contested. What is contested is what will be the mandate. Will people vote for him? Will people campaign for him? And the question is not about the election, it's about lives. So what can we do, Santita, today to build those movements that are challenging the ability of this president to continue to support genocide? Despite a change in language, we know because of the change in language that he's hearing the protests. We know that they're seeing the polls that say 80% of all Democrats want an immediate permanent ceasefire. We know that they're seeing the 500,000 people voting uncommitted. So how do we turn that to move faster so that it's not just about changing language, but is about changing policy, to say no to genocide, no to unconditional U.S. military aid to Israel, and yes to finally being willing to say we do support international law and we will make that a reality of our policy.
Would you bring us back to front, all of you? It's not about changing a president or even changing a personality as much as it is about changing policy. We've got to save lives. And we have to have a just world, everybody. We can have peace and we can have justice and you can have freedom. You can have all of that. But we have to change our minds and make that happen. Stay tuned for more of this discussion on the second hour of the Santita Jackson Show. Phyllis Bennis, thank you so much. God bless you. Stephen Zunas, Dr. Zunas, Dr. David Gibbs, may God bless all of you. And may God bless all of you who are listening. Whether you believe or not, I just want you to be blessed. You know how I am. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show in just